The Grumman Wildcat was a carrier-based fighter aircraft which saw service during World War II. It was the primary fighter of the United States Navy when they entered the war during 1941. Join me in this video as I build and review the 1/72nd scale plastic model kit of this small yet rugged machine. Hello and welcome to Model Minutes. The kit featured in today's video was chosen by you, the community, during a poll on my channel. It was a very close vote and it won by just 1% over the next closest option. Thanks to everyone who participated. Before I get started with the kit, please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Airfix recommends this kit for those aged 8 years old and older. The Grumman F4F Wildcat I've got comes as part of a starter set. The artwork on the front of the box features the aircraft during a landing on its carrier. The rear of the box features the final painting instructions and decal placement. A flying hour token is included, which if cut out and kept can be redeemed against more kits if you're a member of the Airfix club. Airfix have marked this kit as a skill level 2, meaning that it may be a little more difficult than the other starter sets in the range. Inside the box you'll find a small sheet of decals. They are printed to the usual good standard from Airfix, and as it's part of a starter set, there are not a large number of them. The instructions consist of an A4 booklet which contains safety information, details about the real Grumman Wildcat, and step-by-step pictures which are reasonably easy to follow. These images are printed in selected colours to help clarify the stages as you progress. It's worth noting, however, that there are some options with the construction in this kit, which I'll mention later. But in regards to this, you must check the stages you need in the instructions so that you don't build the parts in the wrong way. Inside a plastic bag, you'll find the plastic components of the kit. 4 light grey plastic sprues hold the majority of the pieces, whilst a smaller clear sprue holds the cockpit canopy and any other clear parts. The mould quality is excellent, with virtually no flash being present. The details are well moulded and represented, with recessed panel lines being present throughout. This is one of the more recent additions to the Airfix catalogue. The tooling dating back to 2015 and the quality reflects that. 6 Humbrol acrylic paints are included with the set, and these are 24 matte yellow, 27 matte sea grey, 33 matte black, 34 matte white, 53 gunmetal grey, and 117 matte US light green. Although a small tube of polycement is also part of the set, I will discard this and instead choose to use Tamiya extra thin cement throughout the build, as it has a better flow and bond properties. 2 paintbrushes finish off the set. They look to be of a good quality and are of different thicknesses, allowing you to paint larger areas as well as finer details. The plastic parts were given a wash in warm soapy water to help remove any oil or grease that might be left over from the moulding process. This will help give a better surface for the cement and paints to stick to. The parts were then left to air dry. The cockpit components were cut from the sprue with a sharp knife, and any burrs removed with a nail file. These parts can be small and fiddly, so tweezers could be helpful here. The cement was brushed into the correct places and the parts held in place until it had set. The cockpit features more details than previous kits produced by Airfix, and some of the parts, such as the control column, are very fine, so care has to be taken when removing them from the sprue and placing them in position. I decided to assemble the majority of the cockpit parts before painting them, to help ensure good bonds on the plastic surfaces. At this stage, I am painting them with the included Humbrol 117 acrylic US light green. A drop of water was used to help thin the paint and improve its flow, which ensured it got into all the details. A few coats were needed to get a good even finish. I also painted the other internal areas that required this paint, such as the internal walls on the fuselage parts and the engine cowling. The control panel was given a coat of matte black number 33. Whilst I was using this paint, I decided to also paint the propeller and engine parts whilst they were still on the sprue. There are a few decals which depict various controls inside the cockpit. I used Humbrol 135 satin varnish to give these areas a thin coat in preparation for applying the decals. This satin varnish will help prevent silvering of the decals and make them blend into the surface better. When the varnish was dry, the relevant decals were then cut from the sheet and soaked in warm water. Humbrol decal fix was applied to the model in the correct areas, which will help soften the decals into the surface of the plastic. When ready, the decals were slid off their backing paper and carefully positioned. A further coat of decal fix was applied on top of the decals to soften them further. They were then left to dry. The control panel was then cemented into place at the front of the cockpit assembly. Any paint on the bonding surfaces will need to be removed to help create a good bond between the two parts. I had decided to model this aircraft with its landing gear lowered. This was the next part to be constructed. It is worth noting that the option to depict the wheels raised is included, and it is a much simpler step in the construction. The landing gear is quite complicated to build. It consists of a number of fine structures that sort of interlock to each other as they get added to the assembly. Points to Airfix here, I think, for doing a great job of representing this complicated landing gear in this small scale, while still presenting a reasonably sensible manner of building them. Just take your time on this step, as it will take a little patience to get right. When the landing gear struts were finally built, they were given a coat of Humbrol Acrylic 27 Matte Sea Grey as per the instructions. When the paint had dried, the landing gear struts were cemented into place on the front bulkhead of the cockpit assembly. Again, paint will need to be removed to ensure a good solid bond for the cement. The fuselage halves were then removed from their sprues and any rough areas smoothed off with a nail file. I tested the fit of the cockpit and landing gear assembly in between the fuselage halves to see if any adjustment was needed, but due to the excellent mould quality it was nearly a perfect fit. The assembly was then cemented into one half of the fuselage. There are two small windows in the bottom of the aircraft, and these were added at this stage. The parts were removed from the sprue, cleaned up with a nail file, and then cemented into place using a general purpose glue that I know will not react with the clear part and fog them up. Care must be taken whilst handling the fuselage parts until the glue has cured so that the windows don't get pushed inside by accident. The other half of the fuselage was then sandwiched over the top and cemented into place. The extra thin cement is handy here as it can be run along the seam and it gets pulled into the gap by capillary action. The model will need to be held together until the cement has cured. Tape or elastic bands could be used to do this. Next, I assembled the engine components. These come in a number of parts and care will have to be taken as it is designed to allow for a rotating prop. Careful application of the cement will be needed to help ensure this functionality is achieved. The engine is mounted to the nose of the fuselage and then the engine cowling is cemented over the top. I will leave the propeller off for now, adding it later in the construction to prevent damaging it. The elevator and rudder surfaces are then added. This is a very straightforward step as they slot into place. The rudder may need to be held in place to prevent it from moving whilst it sets. The wing components were then cut from the sprue and the rough areas cleaned up. It's worth noting that Airfix have also included the option to depict the wings folded, and although it looked to be a very interesting manner of displaying the aircraft, I decided to model the wings extended. Perhaps I'll build them folded if I get another one of these kits. Prior to cementing the two halves together, if you choose to use the included drop tanks on your model, the holes in the lower wing will have to be opened up. I used my knife to do this, but a fine drill bit would work just as well. The two halves of the wing are then cemented together and held until set. The wings are then cemented into place on the fuselage. This is straightforward and easy to complete. The ailerons which are the moving surfaces on the wings which control the roll of the plane, were then removed from the sprues and cemented into position. It's at this stage now that I'm ready to start painting. I begin by thinning the included Humbrol 34 white with Tamiya acrylic thinners. I'm using this instead of water, which I normally use, as I've had difficulties with Humbrol 34 before, and I wanted to see if the Tamiya thinner would help improve it. A ratio of about 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner was used, but there was no exact science, and it was mostly trial and error. I started with this colour as it is the lightest, and it's always easier to paint a dark colour over a light one than the other way round. This paint was used to cover the entirety of the lower surfaces of the model, following the painting instructions and taking care to avoid getting any of the paint on the clear windows installed previously. A few coats would be needed to get a good finish. Next, I repeated the process, again using the Tamiya thinners, but this time with Humbrol 27 Matte Sea Grey for the upper surfaces of the model. Again, a few coats would be needed to get a nice even finish. Whilst that paint was drying, I used Humbrol 33 Matte Black on the tyres of the wheels and Humbrol 34 Matte White on their hubs. These were painted on the sprue to make it a little easier. The cockpit canopy was then painted using the 27 Matte Sea Grey. I used a fine brush to follow the moulded details. A few layers would be needed to get a good result and prevent any clear bits on the canopy frames from being visible. It's worth noting that 2 canopies are included, one which depicts the canopy closed and the other open. It's also worth mentioning that a pilot figure is included, but I chose to leave it out of the completed model as I wanted to have the canopy open so the internal detail could be viewed. The drop tanks, which had already been given a coat of Humbrol 34 Matte White, were then removed from the sprues. They came in 2 halves and needed cementing together. It's at this stage I'm adding the final components to the model. The propeller is cemented onto its pin on the nose, the wheels are added to the landing gear, and the drop tanks are cemented into the holes I made earlier in the bottom of the wings. Humbrol 135 acrylic satin varnish was then applied to the areas that were to receive the remainder of the decals. Again, as previously mentioned, a satin or gloss layer is best for applying decals so as to prevent silvering. When this varnish was dry, the decals were then applied. For more details and tips on how to apply decals, have a look for the tutorial I made on this topic on my channel. Whilst you watch the completion of this step, I'll tell you a little bit about the real Grumman F4F Wildcat. Developed from previous biplane fighters by the same company, the Wildcat was first introduced to service by the Royal Navy, despite being designed and built in the United States. Whilst in Royal Navy service, it was called the Martlet, and it saw combat in 1940 and scored the first aerial victory of its type against German bombers. The United States Navy did decide to purchase the aircraft, and it was adopted in October 1941 as the primary carrier fighter, just 2 months before the US entered the war. While serving with the US Navy, it was found to be somewhat lacking in performance and agility in comparison to its main rival, the Mitsubishi Zero. It did have a number of advantages, such as increased armour and self-sealing fuel tanks, which at times allowed this rugged little plane to take damage and still make it back to its carrier. With the introduction of more successful tactics for combating the Zero, it was able to hold its own until it was replaced by the more advanced Hellcat and Corsairs in 1943. The F4F-4 was an improved version of the Wildcat and featured 6 50 cal machine guns in the wings, which was 2 more than the F4F-3 variant. It also had a better wing folding mechanism which allowed more aircraft to be stored aboard aircraft carriers in the same space. It had a maximum speed of 320 miles per hour and a range of 830 miles. The aircraft depicted in this kit is an F4F-4 Wildcat of the escort carrier USS Core in 1944. Having completed the decals and allowed them to cure completely, The entire model was then given a coat of Humbrol enamel matte varnish number 49. This was thinned with white spirit and applied evenly over the model. This layer will help give the aircraft a uniform matte finish, but also help protect the previous acrylic layers. With the varnish dry, Citadel Known Oil acrylic wash was then applied to the recessed details and panel lines of the model. The excess wash was then removed using Tamiya acrylic thinners on a cotton bud. Brushing in the same direction as airflow over the aircraft in an attempt to give some realistic weathering and highlighting of the details. Humbrol metal coat polished aluminium paint was then applied to the model to give a chipped effect. A very fine brush was used and it was added to the areas that could have experienced wear or damage, such as the walkways on the wings, engine cowlings and machine gun loading panels. Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic was then dry brushed to represent smoke or exhaust stains. This was added to the guns and the engine exhausts. The majority of the paint was removed from the brush on a paper towel, then the residue brushed in the direction of airflow in the correct location, helping to leave a realistic stain. The aerial was then added to the model, having been painted on the sprue and left until now to avoid damaging it during the previous stages. The final addition to complete the model was the installation of the cockpit canopy. A general purpose glue was again used to hold these clear parts in place to prevent them from fogging up. And that's as far as I went with the construction of this Grumman F4F Wildcat in 1/72nd scale from Airfix. I feel as though this is a great kit to progress with your construction skills. Being a skill level 2 is well deserved, seeing as the landing gear assembly was quite complex, but if you have already built a few kits, I don't think you should have any issues. The paint scheme is reasonably simple and the low number of decals could help with building up the confidence of any inexperienced modelers. Retailing for about £14 at the time of the video, I feel this to be a little expensive. I'm pretty sure that I bought mine for £10 however, which is more reasonable. I'll add the link for the kit on the Airfix website beneath this video so you can take a look for yourselves. So, in conclusion, this is a great kit with fantastic detail and build options. Perhaps it is a little complicated in areas of its construction, but it shouldn't put off anyone with a little experience. I'm very impressed with this little kit, and maybe I'll be able to get another one and build it as part of a diorama with its wings folded. For now though, I'm very pleased with the results I've managed to achieve with my Airfix Grumman F4F Wildcat. As always, let me know what you think of my build, techniques and finished model in the comments below. I'm also keen to hear your suggestions as to other videos and models that you'd like to see me feature on my channel, so feel free to post that too. All that's left to say is thanks for watching this video and don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe and click that notification button in order to see more content and help support the channel. And feel free to share this video with your family and friends. Don't forget that you can also connect with me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. See you all again next time.